Welcome back, guys, and today we're going to discuss a very popular topic, and that is how to prepare for Azure interviews. I myself have been to quite a few interviews and also done some interviews, and it's always interesting to see how people approach interviews, especially the technical aspect and the technical questions that might appear in the interview for them to test your knowledge. So just a little bit about myself. What makes me knowledgeable on this topic is that I've been certified on Azure when it was still the MCSE infrastructure and platform. And, I've since renewed my certifications. So right now I am a certified Azure administrator as well as certified Azure architect expert. I've also worked in the field, for quite a few years, and I understand, the Azure platform and, what it's used for and what you can actually do with it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and rate the following questions for Azure interviews into three categories. We will have our easy questions and a bit more difficult questions, which will fall under the intermediate category. And then lastly, we will have our difficult or hard questions, which you can actually, where they will test your grit to see, if you really know your stuff. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first question that you might encounter is, what is Azure? It might seem like a simple question, but sometimes the interviewers want to make you feel comfortable, and what you should answer, what they expect to hear from you is that it's a public cloud and that it's split into two areas, or two focus areas rather. So the first area will be your identity, which takes the form of Azure Active Directory. And then secondly, or the other side of the coin, is your virtual data center element where you actually build solutions. Next up, they might add the ante a bit and say, okay, well, what is cloud scaling, or what are the options for cloud scaling? And this is quite simple as well. You get your vertical scaling and you get your horizontal scaling. So let's start with vertical scaling. When you scale vertically, it means that you have a virtual machine, for example, with 2 gigs of RAM and 2 virtual CPUs, and you vertically scale that virtual machine, for example, either up or down to 4 virtual CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM, or 1 virtual CPU and 1 gigs of RAM. And this is, vertical scaling. When it comes to horizontal scaling, this is more of in the form of adding more virtual machines to a cluster. For example, you can have a rule that says auto scaling. Instead of 1 virtual machine handling all of the loads, you can have a rule to say, okay, well, add more virtual machines. When it hits a CPU percentage of example 90%, it can add 2, 3, or 4 nodes, to that cluster. And that's actually what they want to understand, or want to see if you grasp the concept of vertical and horizontal scaling. Next up, they might ask a question that might be along the lines of, what is IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS? And they will want you to explain the difference in those kind of models. So first off, start with the definition, saying IaaS is infrastructure as a service, PaaS is platform as a service, and SaaS is software as a service. And also what you want to explain to them is that there are different models, and why it's important is to see that who is responsible for what on the different models. So let's go ahead and look at the different models quickly. So right here we can see we have our on-premises environment where we can see, you are responsible as an engineer for managing the entire stack. Where it comes to infrastructure as a service, when it's running in the cloud, the customer is responsible from the OS or the operating system all the way up to the application itself. And Azure will take care of, the networking, the storage, the virtualization, the power, to the building, the security side of the physical security side of things. And you're still responsible as an engineer to make sure the application is still secure and your virtual machine is patched and so forth. Next up, we have our platform as a service. This is where the customer is responsible for even less. So we are only responsible for managing the data and the application, and Azure is responsible, for all the other layers. And lastly, when you go to the software as a service tier, it is something you just consume. The vendor is responsible for, from the networking all the way up until the application, which is not a bad thing. And that's where you want to be, for example, like Office 365 offerings. So this summarizes the easy questions that you might have. I know there might be a ton more of easy questions that you might get, but these are some of the easy candidates that they throw out in the interview, which you should definitely ace, which takes about no effort as long as you understand it and you can relay the information and the knowledge that you have properly so that the interviewer can understand and know that you know your stuff. So next up, we have a little bit more difficult questions. This is considered intermediate questions in my eyes. So the first question will be then is, what is the difference between Azure AD and traditional AD? And this is also, quite a tough one if you haven't worked with these technologies before. So we all might be aware of traditional Active Directory, where you have your OUs and you have your GPOs linked to it. And that this is a normal old school administrator role. When it comes to Azure AD, this is more identity based. So this is where you can control the identity. However, you don't have the option, to roll out GPOs or OUs or something like that. Azure AD is more of a flat structure. There are other tool sets that you can use to your benefit. For example, like an Intune or conditional access, stuff that is built into the Azure platform, which you might actually have to pay for. But at the end of the day, you have that to your disposal. But what is important here is to say that they are not directly, comparable. Active Directory on premises is not equal to Azure Active Directory. It's just not how it works. However, when it comes to Azure Active Directory, there is a feature called domain services, which is sort of like on-premises Active Directory. But in general, it's good to differentiate what is Active Directory on premises and, Azure Active Directory. And, just to explain that very good to the interviewer. Next up, seeing that we're talking about identities is, they might ask you a question, like what is RBAC? So RBAC is role-based access control. And how that works in Azure is you can assign, access into 3 tiers, basically. You can assign access to a subscription or at a resource group level or at a resource level. So it's very important to relay that information to say there are different tiers of where you can assign access. And also when it comes to role-based access control, there's a lot of built-in roles that you can assign to a user or an application. But it might be good to also mention that you can create custom RBAC roles as well. For example, you cannot reboot a virtual machine. You can only start a virtual machine, and then you can assign these to contractors that are on your Azure Active Directory tenant. That might actually score you some bonus points. So these are considered the more intermediate questions. I know we're running quite fast through all of these questions, but it's just to give you an idea of what you can expect and how you should answer these questions. All right, so next up we have the questions that are considered hard, and these will actually test if you actually have worked with Azure Active Directory or even Azure in general with the virtual data center side of things. And you can't really convince someone of something, especially with these questions, if you haven't worked with these technologies. So these will actually test your true grit and your depth of your knowledge of this field. So the first question that you can expect is how to do Azure migrations. So this can take the form of virtual machine migrations or even SQL migrations. And what you can mention is in the old days, you could have used, Azure Site Recovery, and you can deploy the agent and then you can just fail over to Azure and then you just never fail back, right? So you could have used that, and or you can also upload custom, if it's a specific virtual hard drive that you want to upload into Azure. You could have done that as well, but that's not really considered a migration per se. But Azure is now pushing really hard on Azure Migrate, the tool. So you have the tool that you can deploy. It can assess your environment, and then at the end of the day, it will show you, what is the size of the virtual machine that you can use, and you can use that tool, to migrate. And when it comes to SQL migrations, you have your data migration service in Azure, and then you can migrate your on-premises SQL databases, for example, to an Azure SQL or an Azure SQL managed instance. You have different options there, but they might ask you stuff like, is it possible to migrate an on-premises SQL database to a managed instance, without, a secure connection? And the answer is no, you can't. And then you can also add that you need to have a VPN connection, a secure connection, to your Azure environment. And then you have two options. You can do an online migration or an offline migration. It all depends on the scenario, but you can just mention that to them as well. And then lastly, one of the big pushes these days or focus areas is security on the Azure platform. And what they might do is they might ask you and say, how would you secure the Azure platform, if cost is not an issue? What are all the tools at your disposal that you can use that is built into the Azure platform? If you have to pay for it or not, what tools are at your disposal? And there are quite a few. So you can mention, VM security extensions that you might use. You can use your network security groups or even, your Azure firewall. You can even store your passwords or your certificates by using Azure Key Vault. That's also quite important. You can also reference privileged identity management, which is part of your Azure tenant that you can just enable. And privileged identity management in general is used to manage identities. And the best way to explain this is by using a scenario. So let's say you have an organization of 100 people and 50 of them have been promoted to global administrator. So you do not really want to have 50 global administrators, or at least statically assigned global administrators. What you want to do is you want to cut that number down to, for example, 10. But you still don't want 10 static assigned, global admins, because if one of those accounts get breached, gone is your tenant, they've got access to the kingdom. So what you want to do is you want to have like one or two, static global administrators, and you will have the 8 other global administrators, but not assigned statically. So they will be normal users, and you roll them into PIM. So when they need those rights or those access, when it comes to global administrators, they will log into the Azure portal to the PIM blade, and they will say, well, I need access for the next amount of hours. And, they will enable it, and then they can, do their global admin duties. And once it's done, they can just remove it. So if that account were ever to be breached, it's a normal user account. It is not a global admin account. And, that at the end of the day, you just want to reduce the attack surface. So this is very important when it comes to identities. Next up, you have your identity protection. This is where you can have more information of all your users, if there might be a breach, if there might be attack, from identity perspective, what is going on. This is always a great tool to reference. And then lastly, also you have your Azure Security Center. So Security Center plugs into all of your subscriptions as well as your identities to a degree, I guess. But what you can reference and explain in the interview is that Security Center is your single pane of glass for security events. This will show you if you have, for example, weak firewall rules, or if your virtual machines has not been patched. It will also show you your relevant compliance status, for example, PCI or ISO 27001 status, which is really relevant to organizations out there. And then the really last thing that you can mention, I know there's a bunch of things that you can mention, but the last thing that you also you just name to them is the conditional access. So you can configure conditional access in conjunction with your Azure Active Directory tenant to say, for example, your organization only operates within, Europe. It should block access, if someone wants to, brute force an account, they can't, because, you're only allowed to log in, to your Azure tenant via a Europe public IP address and not an African public IP address, or even vice versa, depending on the scenario. You can also force multi-factor authentication. So there's a big drive in, doing away with those passwords. So you can still have a large password or a long password, but that alone is not enough these days. So what you want to do is you want to have your password, but also make use of a second additional factor. That can be in the form of your Microsoft Authenticator app on your phone, or a phone call, or SMS, whatever the case may be, but you can just reference that, say multi-factor authentication. That's where it's at these days with security, especially with, all these breaches that's happening with the identity. In the old days, they used to say, firewall was the perimeter, you had to protect, everything via the firewall. These days, when it comes to, cloud computing, it is considered that the identity is the perimeter. You need to protect the identity at almost all costs, because, that is the vector that's the most attacked these days. And it makes sense because, if you look at all the amount of identities out there, stuff like that, people with weak passwords, they will get exposed and breached. And that's not a good place to be. So lastly, let's just do a recap. So, there might be different tiers of questions that you might get asked in an interview. It's always good just to prepare, from the easy questions to the intermediate and also the most difficult questions. Sometimes you might not have the expertise to answer, a very difficult question if it relates to a particular situation or scenario. But my recommendation is to be upfront and say, well, I haven't had the opportunity yet to work on this solution or on this technology yet. However, I've worked with something along those lines if you have, and then explain, what you've done, and actually explain your problem solving skills and display it to them so that they understand, you might not have the opportunity to work with this technology stack yet, but you're keen to work on it, and that you are the type of person that actually wants to, find answers and, just not leave, issues, hanging in the air, that you will push through no matter what, and that you will get answers for the organization from a security or even a technical point of view, drive that through, and then they will know, you're a good candidate, you've got a good attitude. And attitude always plays a big role in, in an interview to see, are you excited to be at the interview? Have you prepared, from a soft skills perspective and also from a technical perspective, like we've done in this demo or in this video rather, to say, well, I know some of these questions that might come my way and also I know how to answer them. And hopefully this will make you more confident in the interview and that you will be able to ace that job interview and land your next Azure job. So good luck out there and all the best to you.